I guess we should do the talk. Thanks so much for coming out. Second day. Everybody okay still? It's a long 3 days. It's a lot to absorb all at once. It can be challenging to take it all on. And we have the party tonight, which means that Friday will be even more difficult. If we do it right anyway. My name's Richard Campbell. I've been doing this for a fairly long time. I have a lot of gray hair now, so I mostly get to do history talks and sometimes some futures talks. I'm working on a book on the history of .NET. If you're a .NET fan, I've been working on it for a few years now. I am fairly desperate to get it finished. This is a piece of that story that folks were asking about when Maui appeared, and it's like, well, there's a lineage here. And so they asked, well, can you put that lineage together? I make a fair number of podcasts. Any .NET Rocks listeners? I mean, I'm not counting Mr. Skeet, who's also been a regular guest. Thanks for coming out. My friend Carl started .NET Rocks back in 2002, which is before the word podcast existed. And I came on board in 2005. So today we published episode 883, or 1883. So that's a lot of shows. Once a week, talking to a luminaire of some sort. Many of the speakers you see here have been on the show. And we're still doing it. Don't miss a week, every Thursday, since 2002. And I also make a sysadmin show called Run As Radio. So if you're more of the mini type, that's a once every Wednesday, started back in 2007. And for a brief interval, when we weren't sure if .NET rocked, we made a show called The Tablet Show, where we were trying to figure out where tablets would fit in and what Windows 8 was going to do to us and all those sorts of things. But after 130 episodes, we rolled it into .NET Rocks because .NET did rock. Okay, we are going to start at the beginning with this, the GNOME desktop. You will notice how poor the graphics are in this. It's not because I have a poor quality screenshot, it's because it's very low resolution, because it's from the 90s. So our friend Miguel de Icaza was in his early 20s when he immigrated to the United States from Mexico. And he was a very serious Linux developer, as he still is today, and he was trying to get a good windowing desktop for Linux. And so this was the GNOME desktop. He originally called it Helix, but he couldn't copyright that name, and so they changed it to the GNOME desktop. So that's in 99. That's where some of the first work that Miguel was doing. Around about that same time in 2000, and you'll notice how crisp this graphic looks. Why? Like this one's ugly because the native resolution on this thing was like 640 by 480. But so was the PDC in 2000, except that I had a graphic designer remake the graphic in 1080p. So I am the only one of the good-looking graphics from PDC 2000. Microsoft people ask me for this. It's like, no, this is mine. I paid for it. I know it looks like yours, but this is when .NET was first talked about. It still wouldn't ship for another 2 years. But this is the first time it was presented to the world. It was Steve Ballmer that was doing it. You got to remember the time. In November of 99, Microsoft had been declared a pernicious monopoly by the Department of Justice of the United States and were ordered to break up into two companies, an operating system company and an everything else company. And in January of 2000, Bill Gates stepped down as the CEO and Steve Ballmer took it over. This was something that was already in process before all of this stuff went down. But Steve's first mission was to stop the company from being broken up, which he succeeded at, we know in hindsight. But at the time, that was kind of a big deal. And in the midst of this, there was this new development platform that they'd been working on since the late 90s. And so if they were going to present it to the world, knowing in the context of trying to keep the company together, Steve talked about, originally this was the next generation Windows services, but they changed that to next generation web services. And then it was going to be based on a set of open standards. And in fact, at this show, they announced that the C# specification and the IL specifications would be published as ECMA standards. They were just going to publish all the stuff. Now, they didn't publish enough stuff for anybody to actually do anything with, but these were part of the grand gestures to keep the company together. It was part of the motivation to do all of this, was to take care of that, to get to that consent decree, which they would actually pull off. And a bunch of folks that were working with Miguel at the time, guys like Reese Weatherly and Sark Friedman, started working through those specifications and starting to reverse engineer the early .NET specifications, say, could we make this work elsewhere? And they were relatively successful. So Miguel had set up a new company called Xamarin in 2001. And this is the same time that Steve is now feeling his oats as CEO. So he says pleasant things like, Linux is a cancer. Well, he's really talking about the GPL, right? And how it attaches itself to intellectual property. And so in July of 2001, and this is the photograph from the conference agenda from the O'Reilly conference in 2001. So this is our 26-year-old Miguel de Icaza announces that they're going to reverse engineer .NET to run on Linux. And of course, he calls it the Mono project. So that's the beginning. And it was that series of events of Miguel working in the Linux space and trying to build good tools, Microsoft in this situation with a new platform and needing to make it more open, however unintentional they were about that, and some very smart people saying, let's do something with this. They liked C#. It was like Java without the mistakes. And they liked the idea of an object-first language. You know, this is 2000, 2001. These are early days. You know, our minds have changed over time from there. But this was a big deal. And so these folks jumped on board with it and worked really hard to try and do it and kind of messed up their lives. You know, the Linux folks were not big fans of Windows. So they're kind of hostile to that team. It's like, why would you work with a Microsoft technology? What's wrong with you? And the Microsoft guys were all kind of, aren't you a Linux person? So they literally put themselves in this in-between place long before the rest of us could really be comfortable with it and tried to do the right things. Now, Xamarin only had so much money, and along came Novell a couple of years in and said, hey, we like what you're doing. We recognize that Linux is going to be part of our future. With SUSE, we're going to go further. So, you know, why don't you come under us? And so Xamarin's acquired by Novell in 2003. Now, the Microsoft parallel of that, this is another one of those graphics that I had upscaled, the PDC of 03. This is when .NET's now shipped. It shipped in 2002. In fact, a month after this show, they would ship the .NET 1.1. But this was the coming out party for the next Windows. Microsoft had put out XP in November of 2001, which is not a great version of XP. The one we would like would be a little bit later on. But now they're already speaking about the next version of Windows. And they've dominated the market. They're 90+%. So they kind of ran wild. Like, what would you build if you dominate the operating system? Now you can do anything you want. The code name for XP was Whistler. Whistler is the name of a ski mountain not far from where I'm from in British Columbia. And a lot of Microsoft people, including Bill Gates, routinely drive up through into Canada to go to the Whistler ski mountain. There's an apocryphal story about Gates being broken down on the Highway 99, which is kind of a wilderness mountain highway to get up to Whistler. And the guy who came and helped him and got him on his way, Bill thanked him by paying off his mortgage because, you know, Bill. Don't know if it's actually true, but it's one of those great stories. So in 2003, they're going to show off this new operating system. And the original design to come after Whistler, the code name was Blackcomb, which is like the next ski mountain over. And Bill was leading the architecture on this because he had left as CEO. He was now chief architect, and he had entirely too much time on his hands. And so he wanted to object-orient an entire operating system. And so Blackcomb was this magnificent concept of an object-oriented operating system that the rest of the team eventually said, we can't actually build this. And so they dialed it back. They tried to simplify the ideas of everything that was going to be in there. And if you ever get up to Whistler Village, where the Whistler Mountain and the Blackcomb Mountain are side by side, there's a really big bar right in between the two mountains called the Longhorn Bar. And so the dialed back version of Windows was called Longhorn. And it was made up, and we heard about this at the PDC 03, of the 4 pillars of Avalon, a new envisioning system, Indigo, a new communications infrastructure, WinFS, an object-oriented file system, and Arrow, a semi-transparent new dashboard for Windows. It was a great, massive concept. People were really excited about that. They also had birds of a feather sessions at this conference in 2003. So there was sort of an open call for sessions. And Miguel de Icaza submitted a mono session to PDC 03 that got the most votes of any session of the conference. But oddly enough, it didn't go ahead. But Miguel came anyway, and I remember being at this conference down in Los Angeles, and he had an entourage on. There was literally just a flock of people that followed Miguel everywhere he went. And I said there wasn't going to be any audio, and here's an audio slide, but I'll just go past it. There was a party on a rooftop bar in LA where Don Box serenaded Miguel de Icaza to join Microsoft. He'd rewritten the words to the song Michelle to say Miguel instead. And my friend Carl Franklin, the co-host of .NET Rocks, he's actually playing guitar in the background of this. That's Carl right there. But yes, Don sang to Miguel to try and convince him to join Microsoft. He didn't do it. At the same time, there was this games company that first came to light really in 2004, shortly after that PDC, called Over the Edge Games. They've been writing in Python to make games, but having looked at the potential of Mono and the C# development environment and the fact that I could compile all these different platforms, they said, hey, this is a better way to go, and reached out to the Mono folks and worked closely with them pretty much from the outset. This is the company that would become Unity. But in 2004, they were called Over the Edge. Bomber had a relationship with Novell in 2006. They called it the Linux Collaboration. So that's Ronald Husveplin. And Microsoft bought $240 million worth of SUSE Linux descriptions. They were dealing with patent violations and a bunch of other things. This is them trying to work a deal. So as much as this is only a few years after he just said Linux was a cancer, and Ballmer was coming around. This did not make the news the way the Linux is a cancer thing made the news. But Steve could be persuaded, and so they were trying to establish a relationship. It had serious problems, and then the iPhone came along and really wrecked everything. Actually, it was a catalyst. The funny part is this phone in 2007 was not that good. This was a 2G phone. It became good, but the first rev of it was not phenomenal. It was also locked. In fact, Steve Jobs made a point. He said, if you're going to write for the iPhone, you're going to make it in Safari. In 2007, Jobs already saw HTML5, which wouldn't be ratified for another 8 years. But at the time, it's like, well, HTML5 is coming. That's a good enough programming model. That's enough. Jobs was wrong. It didn't take very long for the hackers to get to work and jailbreak the phone and do what they wanted. And that forced Apple to release the internal development tools, Cocoa and Xcode and all of those. The reason they were a mess is they were internal tools. They were never meant for consumers to use. But he was forced into it by the jailbreaking process. Meantime, Over the Edge sees as a way to make iPhone games, right? And at a time when there was this huge market rush, this phone was rapidly in demand. People were very excited about it. And so they wanted to get on board with that. And the fact that Apple was forced into making that app store. It's like, if we're going to release these tools and let you code for it, we have to have some governance of it. So, okay, well, we'll make an app store. Like today, we have this whole controversy around the EU and so forth, and charging 30% is way too much. But I love the fact that they were forced into the app store. It turned into a multi-billion-dollar revenue model, but it's not like they had a grand plan. They were in a situation where they were about to lose control of their ecosystem. And so they tried to find a path of legitimacy. So it's fine. You can use our tools to write code on our device, but we are going to gatekeep anything that gets installed on the phone. Right? That was their plan from the outset. And so Unity started building against for iOS through Mono for iOS. So the very early few years here of Mono, within the first 5-6 years, they're already showing up on the phone. So they've learned to cross-compile C# into Xcode, right, really C++, to run directly on the device. By PDC 08, so we're fast forward a few years, we're back in Los Angeles again. Miguel's showing off Mono for iOS as a revenue stream for Simian. They can't make much off of Mono. They're trying to do tech support and things like this, but Mono for iOS is a big deal, and they charge $400 a seat for developers, for them to be able to, you can write in C# and you can compile onto iOS. And that is the PDC where Microsoft said, hey, we've got a solution. Well, now let's be clear. This technology came from Avalon for Longhorn, which as it got kicked out of Longhorn to become Vista, it got dumped over onto .NET, and they renamed it Windows Presentation Foundation. And in the original roadmap for Avalon was this idea that not only would it be good for Windows, but it could be good for the web, that it was a lingua franca for rendering web stuff as too. Or they called it WPF Everywhere, WPFE. And that became its code name, because if you have a cool code name like Avalon, you end up with a product name like Windows Presentation Foundation. But if you have a code name like WPFE, then you get a product name like Silverlight. Now, there was another force that was acting on this at the same time, and that was Reed Hastings and Netflix. So Netflix had come to Microsoft and said, listen, we're tired of shipping DVDs to people in red envelopes. We think the internet's going to be a thing, but we need a client that's smart enough to vary bandwidth demands based on available bandwidth. I mean, we need a media-sensitive client. Can you help us? And actually, the first version of Silverlight had no .NET in it whatsoever. It was all driven by JavaScript, but it interfaced with the media server on IIS. And so that Netflix could provide you movies at multiple resolutions, and that Silverlight client could vary which resolution it used based on your available bandwidth. That was their real motivation. But they had an eye to going after another market, which was sort of animated visualizations and complex coding on the web that Adobe largely owned through the Macromedia product known as Flash. And if you doubt that they were going after Flash, let's talk about the name Silverlight. Because Silverlight existed before the product. Silverlight is the name for the debris that you find inside of a flash bulb after you've fired the flash bulb, because Silverlight comes after Flash. That's the path. So the first version was purely a web play. The second version, the fallout of Vista, incorporated a bunch of .NET 3 features, and they implemented the MVVM plan, and that became this development model. It was also Microsoft was shipping and delivering this independent of the iterations of Visual Studio. Visual Studio was coming out every 18 to 24 months, and the rest of the market iterated much faster than that. I'm looking at you, Ruby on Rails. You know, those guys were innovating in the web far faster than Microsoft could because of the slow cadence. And so the leadership at the time, guys like Scott Guthrie, said, hey, we're going to ship this out of band. This is where Codeplex came from. So they pushed it out through Codeplex. So they put out 3 versions of Silverlight in less than 2 years, where the normal cadence for Microsoft was one every other year. It also made things confusing for folks too, because we were used to, hey, every 18 to 24 months we get a box with all the new stuff in it. Let's learn the new stuff. And now we had to download stuff on the internet. Like, who does that? And I actually made a show at the time in .NET Rocks called Is Software Development Getting Too Complicated? Because we were really struggling with what version of Studio did you get? What version of Silverlight did you get? What were the other back-end tools you needed off of Codeplex to sort of assemble a dev kit that you could actually use? Because they didn't have NuGet yet. Because NuGet, at the time, was going to fix all of our problems. There was a version of Silverlight for Linux called Moonlight. This was largely funded by Microsoft. Bob Muglia, who at the time was the president of Server and Tools, quietly connected with Mono through Novell and provided some funds to get a version of Silverlight working on Linux. And it made it up to, I think, about version 2, version 3. Before Silverlight ran into some issues. We may have encountered that. But clearly, you know, the focus was on what to do about Adobe Air, which this is in 2008, trying to become a real development environment. Main thing I remember about Adobe Air is just how much memory it ate, which is why you get to that situation in 2010 with the giant iPhone and Jobs putting out the letter, thoughts on Flash. Because his real concern was, you are killing the battery in my iPad. But he also wasn't wrong when he talked about the security exploit that was the plugin. Because we also forget that in 2008, every holiday season, we all went to our parents' places and replaced the address bars on their their browsers, because every one of them at some point downloaded the plugin that replaced that address bar with some kind of malware. Like that was just a normal part of my Christmas season, was fixing everybody's frickin' browser. And eliminating that plugin made that go away, but it also screwed Air and it screwed Silverlight. And a bunch of other things. Like there was some good stuff that was in amongst all of that malware. And not that Safari owned the market, they didn't, but they were the harbinger of this, we have to do better here. Let's come up with a better model. Meantime, 2009, MonoTouch for iPhone is in full swing with their license. You can build it in C#. The iPad is now out, and we have our whole thoughts on Flash craziness. But also that's the point where Apple said, hey, we're changing our deployment license. If you want to be in the store, you have to develop in Objective-C. So there was this moment where everybody was like, oh man, like all of this crowd, all the phone gap guys, all of the mono guys, all of us were suddenly like, ooh, it's what we're doing against the rules. It never got enforced, and it never got withdrawn. It just, per se, they never announced withdrawing it. They just, the FTC showed up and said to Apple, are you really gonna do that? And they're like, I don't know what you're talking about. It's not even in the contract. It just sort of went away. But for about 6 months or so, we were really concerned that all of the cross-platform methodologies we were playing with, because we needed to develop on more than one platform, Apple was going to block them. You either wrote natively for their platform or you didn't write at all. But even that was a step too far, and they backed off on it. And into this comes this lovely device. God, I miss it. So, historically speaking, if you really want to screw over a phone ecosystem, like this is a tour de force of how to do it. I know every time we make a new version of this phone, let's throw away all of the apps and tell the developers we need to start again. 3 times in a row. That was impressive. But it was Win 7. It was the early days. They hadn't even made the deal with Nokia yet. They'd taken a stripped down version of Silverlight and said, here, you can code like this. Now, Microsoft had a long mobile history before that with the CE editions, and they worked closely with the vendors at the time, right? We did a .NET Rocks episode where we literally talked to the guy that did the build your own OS for CE. So the hardware vendor could go in and spec out, this is the chipset I'm using, this is the processor I'm using, here is the radio chipset, like how much memory, the range of options and so forth, and it would spit out a version of CE for them. So they could literally have a version of CE specific to the device, because that's what the phone vendors want. Each of their devices are bespoke. They're trying to protect their networks, so they don't want everything to update at once. So they fragment their market into unique devices, so they update independently, or mostly just get replaced and you never update them. So you don't have to do tech support for multiple versions, like life is easier. And Microsoft catered to that. And then they watched Apple walk into the market and say, oh no, we make one device. We update it the way we want to, and you have to follow that or it's not on your network. And AT&T signed up. The best network in North America, which is not saying much, and they utterly crippled it with mass updates from Apple. Like it became a cautionary tale to other ISPs. Don't be like AT&T. So Microsoft makes their try. Okay, we'll make a phone. We got some cool features. We know how to take care of developers. Great development space work. Beats the heck out of Objective-C. Like, have a good time. They didn't know we didn't know at the time that they were going to completely change their mind several times in a row on the phone. But, that was the beginning of that. Now, Android had been around before then, but by 2011, the Mono guys had a version of Mono now that could compile to Android as well. So now you had Mono for iOS and Mono for Android. $400 each, and you could write your code once, and you had a bit of interfacing pieces, and you could compile to both to make a ZAP file on one side and deploy out to Android on the other side. Remarkable. So now that things are working well for them in 2011, along comes Attachmate. So Novell's struggling to survive. Attachmate makes them an offer they can't refuse. And remember, their primary business here is Linux, right? And so Mono's kind of off on the side, much less Mono for iOS, Mono for Android. They don't think all that much of it. So as they're going through the acquisition, they decide, the Attachmate folks are like, this is important. So they actually reach out to Miguel and they say, hey, we'd like you to lay off all the Mono staff, and when you're finished, why don't you lay yourself off too? So Miguel isn't so excited about all this, so he says, he literally reaches out to the people he has to lay off and says, do me a favor and don't go get a new job. Like, just hang in here with your severance for the next few weeks. I'm gonna try something. And he tries to buy back the license for Mono from Attachmate. Now, Attachmate's taking over a non-trivial amount of debt from Novell, and they're doing it with debt financing, so they have banks involved. And so the banks have a vision of what a piece of software is worth, because banks don't understand software. And so the idea that you're going to sell it off for less than millions of dollars, when you know perfectly well without the dev team it's worth nothing, they won't sell it. And it was very much a near-death thing. And Miguel brings in his friend Nat Friedman, and they negotiate. They say, we're not going to sell it. You can own it. Sell us an in perpetuity license for $1. They're like, all right. The banks don't mind that. They made $1. And that literally was the model. And nobody else can work on it. Like, but yeah, it stayed under Attachmate until much later. And this company we now know as Xamarin. So in 2011, Xamarin gets formed. They raised $12.5 million that year, because they have a good hybrid mobile development story for both Android and iOS. Oh, and you can write for Windows Phone as well, that both people who are using that phone will love it. Right? Meantime, Microsoft is eating his own head in a different way. They're making Build. You notice this graphic does not look as good as the old graphics. I have not had this one remade. It's from 2011. It shouldn't be this bad. Anyway, this is the first Build. This is the Build where Carl and I went to a Microsoft conference, and they didn't talk about .NET. And I came out of that conference and said, dude, what if .NET doesn't rock? We make a show. And that's when we launched. We literally, if you look at the date of the first tablet show, it's November of 2011. It's from coming out of Build to going, wow. You know, after the iPad shipped, Microsoft went all in on we need an answer to tablets. The iPad represents an existential threat to Windows. I don't think they were right, but they didn't know. Nobody knew. You know, we didn't know that the iPad wasn't just going to keep growing forever. That it was going to plateau to this sort of ambient level that it's sitting at today. But at the time, it's like, this is going to take over everything. You know, when the iPad shipped and it was $800 in 2010, we were racing, the industry was trying to make a $500 laptop, which is just as awful as you think it would be. They'd got it down to like $700-800, but it was basically a plastic box that if you looked at it the wrong way, it fell apart. Right? They were terrible machines. And in came this gorgeous device for $800. Like, why would you buy that crappy laptop when you have this beautiful thing? So immediately, all those cheap laptops, they died. That market was over. And so this perception of the iPad's going to replace the PC became big. I mean, the big thing I would argue is it saved the laptop industry, because the only way the laptop made sense was to bounce up to around $1,200-1,500 and make something nice that had more functionality than the iPad. Then, of course, the Mac Air came along and made us all look like fools again, but that's a separate issue. Let's skip that part. There's Microsoft making a conference about how we're going to solve tablets with this new operating system. They've involved none of their partners. And oh, by the way, you don't use C# to develop it. And it went well. No, really. So a year later, in 2012, when they're actually going to launch Windows 8, and they've got their own Windows Store, and 80% of the apps are C# and XAML anyway. You know, the initial moves where they weren't going to really allow C# to run on it at all. And then eventually they came around and said, okay, we'll do it a little. And then that were the only people who came to play in the Windows 8 game. Yes, the JavaScript people could develop. They just had to use this thing called WinJS that, you know, they told us was JavaScript till you looked at it. Like, you can write some ugly JavaScript if you try, but WinJS was in a different league. And nobody built anything with it, for the most part. So the writing was on the wall, and Win8 was in the situation, and they just went the other way. This is also when they first announced TypeScript, so there was some good news. What was interesting about TypeScript was that Anders had moved off of the C# team to focus on that. In fact, when he made that move back in 2010, I said on .NET Rocks, I wonder if the only true believer left for C# is Miguel de Icaza, and he doesn't work for the company. Now, that was unfair to Anders because he had handed it off to Mads Torgensen, who's absolutely one of the greatest C# believers that exists anywhere in this world. But Anders genuinely wanted to address the web development problem, and he came up with TypeScript. And Anders is not an open source guy. Like, he just likes making dev tools. He's a brilliant, brilliant man. I mean, he used to be at Novell. He'd worked on Delphi and Turbo Pascal and many other things. And what he did in TypeScript was profound. But there was a belief in Microsoft that you couldn't do anything in open source, that we're enemies of open source, and the open source community will have nothing to do with us. Then out came TypeScript, and the open source community embraced it, loved it, added to it, created TL files for all kinds of platforms. A bunch of the Eclipse folks made an Eclipse plugin for it. Like it shocked Microsoft. It's like, hey, if you actually make a good thing without being bound by any nasty licensing and so forth, we will take it on. And I would argue that without the success of TypeScript, VS Code would never have existed. Because part of what made VS Code even possible was this idea that when we do the right thing, it makes sense for us to be an open source. I have another talk called How Open Source Came to Microsoft, and it just comes at that problem from another angle rather than being focused on Xamarin. Meantime, Xamarin has gotten more funding. They're on their third round, so they got a lot more money. They buy a company called Less Painful in Denmark, out of Denmark, because they're trying to figure out how to make mobile testing work across multiple devices. These guys did a very cool thing where they literally owned one of every phone, and they put them in racks with cameras over top of them, and you could rent them on demand, essentially. So if you want to see, this is the problem with mobile development. We call it the drawer of broken dreams, right? Okay, so you take the three most popular phones, right? So you've got your, this is going back a few years. So like your S20 and an iPhone 8, and you make sure it all works on that. And once it all works on that, you're great. Okay, let's go to the next most popular phone. It doesn't quite render right on that phone. So then you tweak it a bit, and then you go back and check on the original phone and make sure it still works there. And it might not, so you have to fix it so it now works on both phones. You're like, okay, I'm good. And then you have to go back to the drawer of broken dreams for the next most popular phone. And at least when it's iOS, it's like 2 phones, maybe 3. It's all the same OS anyway. But in the Android drawer, it's like 200 phones. That is a drawer of broken dreams. And so with Less, you had all those phones you could rent on demand in these huge racks. At least you could see it all at once. You could run them all simultaneously and iterate on that. That became Xamarin Test Cloud, which today we know is App Center. Although I don't even know how much longer that's going to last. They're changing the way you approach mobile development bit by bit. All right. Then we get the happy build. So we've had the 2 unhappy builds. In the meantime, there's been new leadership at Microsoft. This has been Satya Nadella comes on board. Now, there's a bunch of reasons why Satya should have come on board. Let's face it, Win 8 was a bit of a disaster. And there was sort of an acknowledgement that they had to change gears, that the focus was no longer on the operating system. It was going to be on the cloud. That was the innovative product for Microsoft. That Microsoft's new world would be a cloud-centric world, which means we need to be more friendly to more operating systems. Now, this is we can easily say that, but you understand, Microsoft had made a business of being Windows first for 30 years. And the argument there was that Steve was one of the greatest cheerleaders of the Windows first mindset, and now he was an obstacle to success, time for a new leader. And a guy that came out of the internet side. Satya ran Bing for the longest time. And now he was in charge of server and tools. And so he got promoted up. And he was the CEO as of 2013, but we all really got to see him in 2014. And 2014 is this pivotal moment at Microsoft, because not only did they put out the .NET Foundation, they also announced that Windows was free on any device with a screen 9 inches or smaller. Windows free. Like, they kind of said that casually, but it was like sort of a signal. It's like, Windows is not our primary focus anymore. We've been doing this cloud thing for a few years now, and now it's what we're going to be about. And that means we're all about open source. So they announced the .NET Foundation. They finally shipped Roslyn, the C# compiler as a service, but they ship it cross-platform, open source. And our friend Anders Halsberg got to walk out on stage at that keynote and push a button that made the repository appear on GitHub. So, all signals of Microsoft's focused on other things. And we really thought they were going to buy Xamarin that day too. Like, a lot of us were like, you're going to buy Xamarin, right? You're going to buy Xamarin. They didn't buy Xamarin. Nope, that came 2 years later. 2016 is when they actually acquired Xamarin. So Xamarin had been making some interesting moves at the time. They had done a bunch of different work. They raised another round of money in 2014, and they started making Java implementations. So they were now trying to do cross-platform Java. So you write natively for Android because you write Java code for iOS. Microsoft was starting to work on .NET Core. So now they are going down the open source path. So it's like, okay, we're going to rewrite .NET all open source because it's so intertwined with Windows, there's no way for us to take the existing code base. We're just going to start over. And they're doing everything on GitHub. So Microsoft's also learning how to develop on GitHub rather than their internal tools, which is why the first couple of versions, it's hard to imagine. .NET Core started in 2014. We would not see working bits until really 2016, 2017. It just took they were changing the way they wrote code as well as writing a lot of code. So it took a while to actually get out the door. Xamarin solved their Java problem with RoboVM. They acquired this company that did a Java to iOS compiler. And they were out of Sweden. And so they also started working on a Swift to Android solution too. So they're just trying to be cross-platform for all of the things, which to me was a signal of they're not that Microsoft-centric anymore. Like they're doing C#, their heart was in C#, but now they're doing an awful lot in Java, and starting to work across other languages as well. I would argue that 2015 with Studio 2015, which is also when we get Windows 10. This is the post-Win 8 era, so the sort of blunders are over. Microsoft's kind of got their ship in order. They're focused on open source. Azure is their first product they want to sell you. Windows is stabilized. They've changed the Windows team around. 10 was supposed to be the last version of Windows. They lied, but they had the best of intentions. It's 2015, and they're like, "This is it, man." They were fine until Mac OS 11 came out. Then apparently we need another version number. So. But yeah, no, they were trying to be just on 10. 2015, I think, is still the reference version. Like they make lots of versions of Studio, but I only think of a few reference versions. 2005 was a reference version. 2010 was a reference version. 2015 is a reference version. And for the most part, you can take a project from 2015 and open it in 2022 and it just works the same. There's really been no major breaking changes since. That I would say, 22 is actually a better version, but mostly because it looks like 2015 is just faster. And it has, the GitHub integrations are better. It's easier to work in the cloud. There's lots of nice things. The better version of C#, all of that stuff. But really, it's kind of the same. I talked a little about Studio Code earlier, but this is when Studio Code comes out. It was an intentional, from the beginning, open source project. It's like, okay, we had an accidental hit with TypeScript. And we've now doing these other things in open source that seem to be going well. Why don't we just do something from scratch with this is a team of Ayers and a group of guys that were all over. We can do this right. And they did. I mean, more people run code that are non-Microsoft than Microsoft people use code. That's crazy. If you want to talk about the changing culture, Microsoft coming to the broader market, this is the example. By 2021, it's the #1 editor on the planet. Not bad. No money involved, really, right? Now, they've done some stupid stuff since, I know, but their intentions were good in 2015, and it did very well for quite a while. So in 2016, the conversation started in 2015, but in 2016, Xamarin does get acquired. We were very fortunate at .NET Rocks that we got permission to interview Matt and Miguel ahead of the announcement, which is kind of an SEC thing. It was a big deal, but we got a 1-hour show in the can about what it meant, what they were thinking about, and so forth. And we got to sit in the crowd at the Build event in 2016. And the moment they announced, we've acquired Xamarin, then we published the show. Because, before that, then you'd be leaking information, right? So they both joined Microsoft. So John Box got his wish. Only 13 years late. Miguel went on to be a distinguished engineer, he subsequently left. And Nat Friedman became a VP over on the tool side of things. He was involved with Team Foundation Server, things like that, although he would end up running GitHub. Microsoft would go on to acquire GitHub. He would become the first CEO. And they both subsequently moved on to other things, which is normal a few years later. And that leads us to the Maui story. So before Maui, we've now sort of gotten through all of this stuff. We've got an iOS solution, we've got an Android solution. They're all built separately. We're looking at the overarching problem. We've also got a fragmentation of .NET itself. There was the mobile versions that were originally built for WinPhone. So they're kind of the orphan. There's a version that was specifically for Windows 8 and for Windows that ran separately from the version that lives inside of DevDiv. There's a couple of different flavors of WPF. Like, it's very fragmented. And so Microsoft had this idea, let's create a .NET standard. They presented to us as things that we could do and that the vendors would do, that the Telerix and so forth that made the control suites, they would apply to the standard. But let me tell you the honest truth. This was for Microsoft. This was publicly announcing Microsoft trying to get to one version of .NET. And it took years because you literally got competing implementations of features. So they try to just get a bunch of the names the same, try to get the functionality the same. They have these different stacks. They're building core. I have not said anything about Universal Windows Platform, and I'm going to try not to because it just makes me cry. And then it had this whole Xamarin piece. So this effort of just trying to have all these different ways to build code, people live in different ponds, right? You know, if you're a long time .NET developer, you're over here in the framework. You've made a lot of, this is paid for your house. You put your kids through school with this, right? And your company bets on it. Then they went and wrote a new one. Like, why? Why would you do that? What did I do wrong? How did I ever hurt you? But there's some new developers that are happily living in that space. And it's way more web-centric. Like, it's lighter weight. It runs well in Linux. It's great in the cloud. So, you know, that's cool, except for that whole thing where all the stuff that I love is over in the framework and I can't run it, you know. I've been making this .NET Rocks thing for a long time. I get a lot of emails from a lot of people. You know, there's a guy who's made his career on web forms. Right? That's he got into the space in 2004. He's had 15 years. His company wants him to keep maintaining him. And now it's not coming with. Now, the good thing about Microsoft is they never retire anything. Like, I would point out that in Windows 11, the Visual Basic Runtime ships with it. VB Run 600 DLL is in the box in Windows 11. Last updated 1999. And Windows itself has dependencies on the .NET framework, on 4.8. And they will probably be there for decades. So, you know, Microsoft's taking big bets on the stack. Like, they're not going away. They're just not going to get a lot of love, right? Like, we've already had the schism now where C# features are only in core. Like, that's gone on. So Microsoft is trying to take care of us while schisming these different things. So .NET Standard was a success. Once they got to 2.1, largely nobody cares anymore. They've kind of got all the .NET versions together. They're happy. So you don't hear much about .NET Standard anymore. So they tried the same thing for XAML, because XAML was also fragmented, right? And let's be clear, Xamarin Forms is a flavor of XAML. Then you got the WPF flavor of XAML. There's a few others, like there's big fragmentations in the XAML space. It's just that this didn't go well. There are far more competing forces going on inside of this space. And one of them was the Windows team themselves. And they kind of went into their own space with this thing called WinUI. So this is where UWP says, again, the problem is that the WinUI library, at least initially, was part of the Windows team, which means the only way you could get a new version of WinUI was to update Windows. But this was Windows 10, and they were updating Windows every month. Awesome. You know what's fun? Building an app that depends on a particular version of Windows, and then go to your administrator and say, hey, can you update Windows so I can deploy this app? Ha, ha, ha. I've been a sysadmin. The sign on my door says, no. Any questions? Right? You can't get them to upgrade Windows for a new version of an app, and so that breaks that model. Now, the Windows team would eventually figure this out, and they would move WinUI out of Windows, which is where it is today, as of WinUI 3, so that it can be updated independently from Windows itself. And let's face it, nobody was happy shipping a new version of Windows every month or so. So they've dialed that whole thing down too, because we've come to appreciate the only thing we want from an operating system is reliability. The feature set's just not that important. When we get to 2019 with Core 3.1 is really when the essence of .NET Core is completed. All of the stuff that is cross-platform is done. Now we got to start talking about the particular platforms. And in 3.1, we got the Win SDK. So this is when the new version of WinForms showed up that could actually handle high DPI screens and so forth. But it wasn't pixel perfect with the old version of WinForms. So they deliberately made that a schism so that you had to touch the app. is if you just tried to recompile the new one, you're gonna have unhappy users. Like, you gotta look at it. But they've created a place for Windows-specific SDKs to live, with the idea that eventually there might be some other operating systems. Not that it's come to pass, but that was the plan. And in that, now you start to get a shape for the new version of .NET. So they skipped 4 because they were still supporting 4.8. So they went from 3.1 to 5 because numbers are hard. And in 5, they're saying, okay, now we're trying to unify the .NET. So no, they're still not going to leave 4.8 alone. They're just trying not to talk about it anymore. But 5 is where, okay, we have a common infrastructure on the backside, and now you have these different client environments on top. Most of this almost worked. Many of your usual apps could continue to function. It was just a question of, what worked well, what didn't, where the rough edges were. Some of the runtime components are different. The BCL still exists in this, which is a different way of approaching your backend libraries. So they had to continue on from there. So 5 was a good unification attempt, and they tried to not think about .NET Standard anymore. This is now 2020. 2021, this is when the Mono and the .NET BCLs actually unified. So under the hood, this was the moment where most Xamarin technology was now completely incorporated by 2021, and that opens the door for Maui. So now that we have a common backend for all of these different platforms, we can now build a multi-platform UI stack. Now, they were supposed to ship it with .NET 6. They just failed. But they wanted to be clear. They had an impossible task. If you think back to 21, I know it's so long ago, that's Studio 2019, and Studio 2019 was the only version that would run .NET 6. So they were building a unique version of .NET and a unique version of Visual Studio at the same time, and these guys were trying to build a library that depended on both. That's too many dependencies. And so something would have to change in .NET 6 to deal with some other problems that the Studio side was having, or the Studio would have to change things that rippled back there, and it would smash Maui over and over and over. And so by the time we get to November of 2019 for .NET 6, or November 2020 for .NET 6, the Maui team is just not done. They can't be. And it'll take them a few months to catch up. They'll get to that version 1 by the spring of 22. And then by .NET 7, they will be back into sync. By 7.22, they get the next version, version 2 out. And I would argue that the version that just came out in 23 is V3, which, as we know, is always the best version of anything Microsoft makes. So, and it's interesting because when you actually look at the feature set on Maui for .NET 8, it's almost all bug fixes. Like, there's not a lot of new features. It's mostly everything's working the way you expected and performs better. So they've kind of got their things in order. They've also created this community toolkit that gives us places to put sort of key pieces that multiple people contribute to and external folks can contribute to as well. So, what comes next? Well, we're on this impossible cadence of every year we get a new version of .NET. I don't know how much longer it's going to last. They're very much shipping to the date now, so they tend to cut features to make the deadline. There are many features that actually span deployment over multiple versions before they actually get completed, so the model's getting more and more robust. The question is, are the customers even interested? I mean, .NET 8 adoption didn't go quickly. It's coming along, but there's a lot of people sitting on 7 going, this works. And you keep telling me about a long-term support version, but nobody actually seems to care, right? The 8 is supposed to be the LTS version. It's got 3 years worth of support, but it's not like the other versions get unsupported. So really, it's just a question of what you're paying for, how much tech support you call on any of those things. But goodness knows there's Stack Overflow and GitHub Copilot, so who's calling anybody for this? We're still in the very early days of Maui, and there's always a debate about, have they missed the boat or not? But this is a commoditization of client development. The bigger argument today is, what's your justification for building a client at all? I talk to a lot of folks who are like, we build web clients for a reason. The deployment doesn't suck. Like, as soon as you own a client of any kind, you have all of the deployment issues and what version issues you're running, where web clients are always the current version. So a lot of internal apps, it's just what they are. So that we really get into the argument of what a real client is needed for, and can we make the real client experience better? And when you talk to the team, that's what they're focused on, is what are the things that make a real client, a native client, more compelling than the web client? Because the browser's pretty good for a lot of stuff, but there's certain things that you want. So, when you get to the edges of this, you see clients stand up. Then it's like, can you deal with the deployment issues? Do you need the App Store issues? How do you work all around this? And all of that is in flux. If you look at what's going on in the marketplace today, app stores are besieged because they become cash cows for giant tech giants who don't need that as cash cows. And so, for better or worse, the EU is leading on a lot of this stuff, pushing back on, hey, can we have alternatives to this? Can you, stop pocketing billions of dollars for doing very little, and make all of this a bit simpler for us all? So I'm glad Maui's here, because I think the day of the smart client hasn't come yet, but when it does, the tool will be good, because we've had the time to shake out the bits and level off the platform so that the promise of cross-platform development gets good. It's hard, and the customer doesn't care, right? The customer cares that it runs on their device. They don't care it runs on all the devices. We care about that we want to have all those things work. So we kind of come in second to all of that. But as the stack matures, you start to see it's not that painful to support all these different clients. We're not the only game in town. Maui's certainly a great one. I always pay attention to Flutter. I'm impressed with how good Flutter is. Then Flutter's done well enough in iOS and Android. They're now trying to make better versions that work for Windows and Mac OS. So that speaks to this problem isn't solved. Good cross-platform clients are still a hard problem, but they're better than they used to be. Beats the heck out of phone gap or the earlier days. And I hope this was a useful ride for you, just to know that we've been going in steady progression and we are not done. There's more to do. Thank you so much for your time.